Hey everybody, it is Saturday afternoon and we're going to take a trip around the world. I just got done doing some maintenance on a few of the tanks down here, so I figure now's as good a time as any to get a trip around the world done. I feel like I didn't really do a lot this week. I had some issues with some fish that we will talk about when we get around to that tank, and that consumed most of my time, and it was certainly what I was most concerned with over the week, and I really didn't do a whole lot in here. As far as water changes or anything, really. I just kind of did basic feedings and made sure the lights were on and off every day and was busy fussing around with my other tank. So today I got in here real quick and I did a water change on my 29 miscellaneous here. I did a filter change. I didn't bother with the biofilters. It was flowing back through the middle again. This tank backflows very quickly. I'm not sure why the filters get clogged up so quick. But while I was in there and I put new filters on it, I still was getting very little flow. And when I looked at the intake, it didn't just have some stuff stuck to the outside of it. It was packed full of growth. It had like green, sort of soft, fuzzy stuff in it. And it reminded me of, in fact, I can see a little bit of it now. If you look in the back corner, you see that green Marimo moss ball, or what's left of a green Marimo moss ball. It was like that stuff, which is basically algae, and I think it was growing inside the graded part, the opening there. That whole bottom section was just packed almost solid with it. I'm not sure how water was even flowing through it. So I took that off, I got it all scrubbed out, got the filters changed out as I said, and now we're back to a nice normal flow. And again, I'm sure in a day or two we're probably going to have some backflow through the middle there, although my filters could have been getting so clogged because of all of the stuff that was in that intake was being broken loose and taken right up into the filters, and maybe that's what was clogging the filters up so quickly. So we'll have to wait and see if I don't get a little more time between filter changes now, or at least before I start seeing that backflow through the middle of the filter. So that's it. I didn't wipe down the glass. I didn't do anything else. I haven't lost any fish or made any changes in here. So we'll move on to my 55-gallon Gourami tank. This tank, the only real thing to speak of this week is the fact that I lost that little Cory. If you follow along regularly, you'll know that I had one Corydoras in here that sort of kept to itself even when it was on the bottom. The other two swam around together, kept side by side most of the time, like Corys usually do. And I had this one that just kept to itself or swam up near the surface a lot. And that was the only sort of unusual aspect of its behavior. It didn't seem like it was sick, it just seemed like it was weird. And then I found it dead on the bottom of the tank the other day. And so that happened. I also am not really going to be able to do a lot with growing the water sprite back in this tank. I've been watching my Gourami in here. You can actually see this temple plant. Look how raggedy and torn up those leaves are. That is all from that Moonlight Gourami. He's doing it right while we're standing here watching him. He's just munching on that. So Gouramis really like their vegetation. He's even been nibbling on the fern over here, and the Java fern is a really tough plant. Most fish won't eat the Java fern because it's like eating linoleum. Temple plant, however, is nice and tender, and so is water sprite. And then, of course, the roots of the water sprite are really delicacy for the Gourami. And, when your roots are getting eaten off, you don't grow very well as a plant. So probably not going to be able to get a big, lush, flourishing, floating water sprite going on in this tank anymore. But we'll see. That's a fine trade-off as far as I'm concerned. I'd rather have the Gouramis in the tank than a bunch of floating plants. I got the floating plants everywhere. So maybe we'll see about adding some more Gourami. See, you can see him in there tearing it up now. He just all day long, non-stop eating on those plants. I really, really like my little flame Gourami. And it's so tiny. It's tiny it's even smaller than a dwarf Gourami. So I really like that one too. I might add a few more of those. They're very docile and they're very small. So in a 55-gallon tank, I don't think they would take up a lot of space or really interfere with each other. So moving on to my 55-gallon Tbar tank. All I did to this tank was a water change. I gravel vacked the surface. I don't really scrunch it down in the gravel. No need to on this tank, but I do get a lot of pleco poop in this tank. You can see that little weird looking thing right there is the tail of the pleco sticking out. It's a pretty good sized one. You can see that sort of dark mass in there. That's its head, or getting closer towards its head. I don't know where its head is actually, but that's in there somewhere. So, you know, it's lying in the bush right there. So again, pretty good sized pleco. Makes for some pretty good sized poops in this tank. And so I got to get in there fairly regularly and gravel vac and get that out. So I did that. Otherwise, nothing really to speak of or nothing really going on in this tank. But I do want you to take a look at the Anubias in this tank for a moment. I got to get in there again. I got some flowers that are developing or trying to develop. They never fully develop underwater. You have to get in there and snip them off eventually. But you can see I got new growth here. Again, for my regular viewers, you'll know that I've been in here many times and trimmed big chunks of it out. You can see I got all this new growth going on in here. The Anubias does really well in this tank. New growth coming off the end of this rhizome. So that is two, well, it started out as two rhizomes years ago, and it should still be two big main rhizomes there. And for all the trimming and chopping and chunks I've cut off of this over the years, it still looks like that. And that is about 6 years old. So getting over here to my 40 breeder. Sorry, I forgot what I call this tank nowadays. I want you to look at both this Anubias. Now I know it's kind of grungy and has algae and stuff growing all over it, but that is indeed a tiny little dwarf Anubias species. I'm not exactly sure what species it is. And then on the piece of wood right there, that little sort of knurled up looking thing with the growth and stuff all over it, looks all grungy, that is also Anubias. And both of those plants, and this honestly might be more than one plant, I don't know, I don't remember specifically, I think it might be two rhizomes in there from originally. They are the same age, and I've never done anything to them. I've never trimmed them, I've never cut anything off of them. I was looking at it today while I was in there. I did get into this tank, and I didn't do a water change, but I did wipe the glass down. It was getting pretty gross. And you can see I've got plenty of new roots and a new section of rhizome, so I could probably get in there and break that up a little bit, trim it up, and see what happens. All of my old Java fern that was in there seems to have more or less died off, but you can see the roots that were sort of grown into the woodwork are still producing new growth, which I actually kind of like better than that huge mass we had growing in there before. You couldn't even see into the tank. It collected a bunch of crap at the surface, and then the green slime started growing on it at the surface. This just looks better. You can actually see the texture of the wood and the color and the grain. It looks fantastic. So I'm happier with it that way. I'd actually really like that Anubias to get cleaned up the way everything else in this tank has been cleaned up. But I just wanted to point that out as far as the different species and different growth rates. They are the same age. I set these tanks up within a few, I don't know, a month or two of each other. Right around the same time I was sort of putting my fish room together and getting started. I was all enthusiastic. This was the first tank that got set up. And then this one came shortly thereafter. So these technically, I guess, are probably a little younger than these. And don't ask me what either species are. If I had to guess, I think one of them is Anubias nana, but I'm not sure which one it is. I hear Anubias nana, and for some reason I always think that means it's going to be really small, and so I want to point to this stuff, but I think this is the Anubias nana. But again, don't quote me on that. I just think that's what it is. So if you know what it is, feel free to comment and let me know. But that is Anubias. It's tiny little stuff, and that is about 6 years old. Well, all these plants in here are about 6 years old. So that's it. Nothing else going on in this tank. I just did a simple wiping of the glass. I didn't do a water change or anything else. It's a Saturday afternoon, so I've got tomorrow. I can get in here tomorrow and do some maintenance on the tanks that I neglected today. So moving on to my 125-gallon native tank. Speaking of neglected tanks, now I did get in here today and I did do a reasonably significant water change, probably a 20%, something like that. It wasn't huge. I didn't mess with the filter. This tank, in my mind, I've just sort of put it on hold. I swear, other than throwing food in here twice a day or once a day and making sure the lights, come on in the morning. I check it twice a day is what I'm saying. Make sure the lights are on in the morning. I turn the lights off at night, and then usually around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, I feed everybody. And that's it. I have not really given this tank much of a thought, even when, well, you know, when I'm out on the kayak, maybe every now and again I'll see a neat looking piece of wood or something and I'll think about this tank ever so briefly, but that's it. It's a fleeting thought. I've not really dwelled on this tank or really given it thought or consideration in a while. For one, I've had my issues going on, you know, throughout the week that I was more concerned with than anything else, and again, we'll get to that in a minute. But I also just feel like I'm done with this tank, and you know, I've kind of put it on hold until I decide what else I'm going to do with it. So I really don't know what else to say about it. I've only got a few creek chubs left. I think I've got 3 or 4 creek chubs. Yeah, it looks like, no, that's not a creek chub. That's a suckerfish. So I don't know. Maybe there's one in there hiding. 3 or 4 creek chubs, a couple of the shiners, and then I've got 3 of those white suckerfish. And who's going to stay, who's going to go, what the tank's going to eventually become, all that kind of stuff, I don't really know. Yeah, see, I got a couple back there that I didn't even realize. I got a creek chub and a shiner, and there's another suckerfish on the bottom. So, again, I don't know. I haven't given it much thought, so there's not really much to say about it. That's my 125-gallon native tank. Stay tuned, more to come on that one. My snail tank is still just my snail tank. There's probably still some shrimp swimming around in there somewhere. There always are. And there's not really much to talk about with that one. It's just a tank that I keep I keep saying shrimp, snails. There probably are a couple of ghost shrimp swimming around in there, but I use it to breed snails to feed my puffer fish, and occasionally if I get a huge amount of snails in there, I'll throw a few handfuls in some of the tanks that have loaches in them, because the loaches really love the snails too. So I just keep that tank there for a place to have snails to grab. I finally have something to talk about with my purple spotted gudgeon tank today, and that is that I did a great big water change. I wiped the glass down. If you notice, I've got a stream of bubbles in there right in front of the filter. That's a hang on the back filter, so the flow is across the surface right there, where it's, you know, really hitting those bubbles and spreading them around. That's the idea anyway. And that is because I am treating it with ChemiClean. While I was doing my water change today, because this tank sorely needed one, the glass was really getting gross, I was noticing how grungy everything was. It just really needs a good ChemiClean treatment. And by grungy, I mean, you see that sort of fuzzy black stuff growing on the edges here? All of that sort of gross, grungy stuff is what the ChemiClean will kill. Oh, there's my gudgeon. I was wondering where he was. You can see that little thing right there. That's the gudgeon. So yeah, all that grungy stuff, especially like if you look back there at that leaf, see all that crud on it? All that stuff will get killed off by the ChemiClean, and I'll have to do a water change and a filter change and everything when I'm done. But the ChemiClean really cleans that stuff up nicely. So even if you don't have something like an actual cyanobacteria going on in your tank, if you just get this kind of stuff, you know, just this sort of grungy, gross stuff that grows on the surface of leaves, and that is some cyanobacteria in there, there's no doubt. ChemiClean does wonders for that. I'll put a link down below if you're interested in buying it. It's not expensive, and I'm not even sure how much you can actually treat with one bottle, but it's a tiny little scoop per 10 gallons. So 4 little tiny scoops in this tank, I could probably treat this tank, you know, 5 or 6 times over with one little tiny 2-gram container of the ChemiClean. So no big deal. Once or twice a year you have to put an air stone in there. I can't stress that enough. The one and only time I did not use an air stone when I used this product, I had dead fish. So always put an air stone in there when you're using one of these products. I also will be getting back in there when I do my water change. If you see all the brown on the Java, a lot of that is dead, but that's part of the way the Java fern reproduces. You see these 2 little tiny, almost looks like little rabbit ears sticking off that last little bit of green growth on the tip. That's new Java fern. Eventually roots are going to start developing off of that, and that'll sort of grow into a new plant. So even as those are dying off and looking terrible like that, I will go through there and pull that stuff out, and then I can separate out the little babies, get rid of the dead stuff. But in the meantime, I'm just going to let everything that's in there get cleaned up. See, there's another example of a leaf that's very little green left on it, but at the very tip, you can even see the root development already. I've got some new little babies growing off of that. So don't forget, I do sell my Java Fern and Water Sprite and Temple Plant. I've got some Anubias right now. I will also put my email down below. If you're interested in any kind of aquatic plants, let me know. Can't promise you won't get any duckweed in with it, but I do treat it before I put it in my grow out container, so I don't put any of that green, nasty, slimy stuff in there. But again, I can't guarantee no snails, and I can't guarantee no duckweed. That was another thing I did when I did the water change in this tank. I pulled a huge mass of water sprite that was floating. It had so much duckweed around it and in the leaves and everything that it was like a mat of duckweed and water sprite. And so I pulled all of that out and threw it away, and you can still see I've got all that much duckweed over here. I have been told that duckweed does not do well in tanks with a lot of vigorous surface agitation, so I might experiment with that and find out if that's a way to actually eliminate duckweed. Can you set up a temporary, surface agitation with bubble stones or air stones and that sort of thing, and then once you finally killed off all the duckweed, take the air stones out? Would that be an effective way to eliminate duckweed? I don't know, but we might find out. So moving on to my 125, I can't really get in front of it at the moment. I still got buckets and stuff on the floor, but we can kind of start by having a look at this end. The big thing that was going on this week, mostly that I keep hinting and alluding to, is my Synodontis catfish in this tank died this week. And he was about 6 years old, maybe 7, but I want to say he was at least 6 years old. And I don't know what was wrong with him. I don't really want to get into a conversation about what I think might have been wrong with him. The best I can come up with, a few viewers suggested that maybe he picked up a piece of gravel and swallowed some gravel, and that got him impacted, and that wound up being, what killed him. I don't think it was a swim bladder issue, and I've got my reasons why. Again, we can, I don't know, maybe we'll get around to talking about it. It doesn't really matter anymore. He's dead now. It's just something to think about. But I have given it thought. I did watch all the process happening. I did, spend a long time sitting here watching how he behaved and everything. And I don't think it was a swim bladder issue. I think it was either, impacted constipation or just something else. And again, fish die all the time, and they get bloated for no reason. Their kidneys might stop working, and, who knows? Is it bad genetics? Is it old age? Again, for the vast majority of fish that I've lost over the many years I've been keeping fish, and that's a lot of fish over the years, the vast majority of them, I have no idea why they've died. Some of them, it's pretty obvious. I left the heater on, or there was no air stone, or I treated it with some kind of chemical, But I find dead fish all the time. My Cory that I was talking about at the beginning of this video, no idea why that Cory died or what was wrong with it or what was going on. There's nothing going on in my tank. There's nothing wrong with the water. There's nothing wrong with the way I'm keeping the fish or the way it's being housed. It just died. I know there is a cause. I'm not one of those people that say sometimes fish just die as though they simply decide they don't want to be alive anymore. There's obviously some cause, but I have no idea what it is, and I never will in most cases, And that's probably the case with the Synodontis in this tank, No idea what caused him to die. The theory of maybe picking up a piece of gravel, that sounds reasonable. I'll go with that. Gives me a little bit of, I can just sort of wrap it up and brush my hands and say, well, that was tragic and it sucked and I hated watching it happen and everything. I did what I could do. I gave it the Epsom salts bath, to help with the constipation if that was the case. And, I was feeding the algae wafers, but the cat, he had no appetite, wasn't eating anything. I can't force feed it. And so that was that, But I basically spent the whole week fretting and stressing and, basically pacing back and forth in front of the tank, just watching my fish die. And so that's why I haven't really gotten a whole lot done down here this week. Oop, almost dropped the phone there. Sorry about that. So that's it. Yeah, this week I did a water change in this tank. I've done a lot of checks for things like ammonia and nitrate and all that kind of stuff. I got the glass nice and wiped down. I did a filter change. All doing my best to get the tank as clean as I could to help that fish as much as possible. But we lost it anyway, and there you go. So that's really all that's been going on in this tank. No, it's not actually. I always get the spawning behavior from these Marcy rainbow fish, and these Marcy rainbow fish, I get a lot of questions about them. They are indeed beautiful, but they are a hybrid. I don't know the parents, so to speak. I know one of the sources of genes is the Parkinson's rainbow fish. So if you're interested in these rainbow fish, these big ones, then your closest bet that you're going to find is going to be a Parkinson's rainbow fish, because these are sort of a hybrid between a Parkinson's and something else. I don't know what the something else is, but if you look up Marcy rainbow fish, you will probably find links to Parkinson's rainbow fish. Go ahead and follow those links, because I don't really recommend going with the hybrids anyway. Just go with the good old purebred Parkinson's rainbow fish, and you'll be very happy with it. So I see spawning behavior from them a lot. I see spawning behavior from my new albino millennium rainbow fish, which are what these smaller ones are. But this week I have actually noticed a lot of digging and burrowing and cave making from my chocolate zebra plecos. I have 3 chocolate zebras in this tank. Of course, I don't see any of them at the moment. Me standing here in front of the tank shouting at it is probably not the best way to get fairly reclusive fish to come out and show itself. But I do have 3 chocolate zebra plecos in this tank, and they are cave breeders. And you can see how dug out underneath of this piece of wood that is. And you can see how dug out underneath that rock is. And in a couple cases, I've seen more than one pleco under the rock, which is unusual. They usually don't pal around together. So if I understand the way it works correctly, the male, and I know this sounds awful, but the male sort of entices the female into the cave and then more or less traps her in there, and prevents her from leaving until they spawn in there. And so I don't know if that's going to happen. The guy that sold me these fish years ago bred them himself and was getting out of the hobby, and that's why he sold them to me so cheap. And he said, believe me, you put a few of them in your tank and you'll have babies in no time. And that was probably 5 years ago, and I've never seen a baby. I've never even seen them spawn. I've seen a little bit of the cave digging behavior before, but never anything as serious as this. And I've never seen multiple fish down in one cave together. So maybe they need to be, 5 years old before they start spawning. I don't know. But I find that a little hard to believe, too. I don't think the plecos need to be that old before they're ready to spawn. So, who knows? Maybe we'll be seeing some spawning behavior, or maybe I'll have some baby chocolate zebra plecos in the near future or something like that. I don't know. But that's the other thing that is going on in this tank. Again, I've just been so sort of overwhelmed by my catfish that I haven't, my brain's sort of turned off with everything else. So, moving on. Oh, there's one of my little chocolate zebra plecos right now. You can see him wiggling around in there a little bit. So, they're not big, but they are cool. And these are chocolate zebra plecos. They're not true zebra plecos. True zebra plecos, the babies go for $300. Personally, I don't see it, but people are willing to pay that kind of money for them. The adults go for $500 or more. These are not those. These actually go for $30 or $40 a piece in the fish store. These are the chocolate zebra plecos, which are apparently much, much more common than the true zebras. So, moving on. My 20-gallon open-topped angelfish. I'm enjoying looking at just the Java fern growing out of the top. I keep trying to thin it out for the most part and get some of the denseness, a lot of what you're seeing right here. If I pluck these out, let's see if we can actually do it while I'm standing here talking to you about it. A lot of this is just baby plants that are growing through the main bulk of the big one. So what I'll do, you can even see like roots all the way out here. These roots are not from the main central body. These roots are from small growth coming out in the middle. So I'll pull some of that out. It'll thin that out. That will allow me to keep the larger, more spectacular looking fern with the branches and everything, or the fronds rather, sticking up out of the water. But we'll also open it up enough that light will shine through and get into the tank. It's not that this tank is poorly lit. I guess maybe shaking and rooting around and all that stuff was not the best idea before we looked at the tank, because now it looks all cloudy and dirty. But that's okay. I do have my angelfish down here in the corner. I've got a clown pleco in this tank. I just saw him the other day, so I know he's still in there doing his thing. You can also tell by how clean the woodwork and the rocks and everything are that he's definitely still in there doing his thing. I've got some diamond tetras that I believe are spawning, or at least showing spawning behavior. I don't know if they're actually going to produce anything. And then, of course, I've got the 2 female cherry barbs, and then I've got 4 of the bloodfin tetras. So if they do lay any eggs, it's very unlikely any of them are going to survive. And I say 4 bloodfin tetras, although it started out as 6. The other 2 are right there because they decided they were going to jump out of the tank. I found them on the floor. They will be going back. PetSmart has a 2-week guarantee. If you lose any for any reason, they will give you a refund. So I've already bought 4 more. I've got them in my quarantine tank here. And another week or so, once they get done quarantine, I'll be moving them up and putting them into this tank. So instead of just having the little school of 4 of the bloodfins in here, I'll have a nice little school of 8. And I'm hoping with that many of them in there together, they'll pack together a little more tightly and we'll get a little better schooling behavior. And then, of course, with the diamond tetras, they seem to school pretty well, even though there's only 5 of them in there. But now that we've got this spawning behavior going on, they seem a little testy. They seem to be, darting and dashing and all that. And that's to be expected during the spawning behavior. Once that goes away, we should get back to having them swimming around in the tank in a nice little school. So all in all, I'm really happy with the way this tank turned out now that I decided to take that top off and switch the lighting over. I know with the camera, trying to compensate for that bright light on the top of it and, shine in the tank at the same time, it's kind of hard to really get an idea of how that looks. But I like it. So, moving on to my brackish tank. Let's turn this forward light on here. I don't always keep this light on because if I did, I would have so much algae and crud and stuff growing on that glass, you wouldn't believe it. So by leaving it off, unless I'm shooting a video or just want to come in here and actually just enjoy looking at Butterbean himself, I usually leave that light turned off. It's not a very natural looking light either. It's very harsh blue light. I think it was meant, I know it was meant at least for a planted tank, and it may have been meant for a reef tank. I think it's just for a planted tank though, and that's why it's got so much extra blue in there. It's really high energy light, and it makes everything look slightly actinic. Not quite actinic, but a little more blue than really should be in there. And it's also got the, you can see the reflection, it's got the red and the blue, and again, it's meant for a planted tank. And what it winds up doing is giving you a fairly harsh, kind of unnatural look. But it really makes Butterbean pop. You can sure see him stand out when I turn that light on. I have had a few questions asked about him recently in regards to the white markings that were on him, those weird lesions that I was getting. They seem to be clearing up. I mean, you can see that he still has some marks on the back of his head, or the top of his head, whatever you want to call that. But the larger ones, the ones that almost look like scratches and scrapes across his body, have largely gone away. He just seems to have a few little spots left. So I don't know if that was because I kept him in the same salinity for a very long period of time. I don't know if it was because I kept him in too high of a salinity for a very long time. But reducing the salinity to, technically this is no longer a brackish tank. It's very, very close. I'm at 1.003 specific gravity, and by most people's scale, either 1.004 or 1.005 is where brackish water starts and you officially move out of freshwater. So I'm right on the cusp, and he seems to be doing a lot better. My mollies don't seem to like it as much. They don't seem to be as active as they used to, but they're not suffering for it. I keep mollies in freshwater. In fact, I keep mollies in fairly soft water, and while I don't have a very long life expectancies for my mollies that are kept in soft water, they do okay for a few years. That's not too bad. So for being in this, brackish water would probably be ideal for my mollies in here, but in light of the fact that I was having issues with Butterbean, I think they can tolerate being in almost brackish water. It's still a far, far cry from being soft water, that's for sure. And I've also got much, much more vigorous and better growth out of my Java fern that's in this tank. It's still unusual. It's very compact and strange, but look how much more green I've got than, well, again, you have to be a regular viewer to look how much more green I've got than I used to. And you can also notice, look how much less of that orange, brown, rusty looking cyanobacteria I have in here. I swear that stuff thrives in salt water. I know it will grow in fresh water, but this tank has been a prime experiment, and now that I've reduced the salinity in this tank and we're just under that brackish threshold, I've almost eliminated that stuff. I used to get that stuff growing in sheets and carpets in here when I kept the salinity all the way up at 1.008. I kept it a fairly salty, and I would get that stuff growing on the glass. It grew everywhere, and the more I've reduced the salt, the more I've reduced that cyanobacteria, and the more vigorous and green my Java fern in there is looking. So all in all, I'm happy with where this tank has gotten. It's taken a few months to really, positively say this is having a very, very positive benefit of the, impact on this tank. But it very clearly is having a very positive impact on this tank. And so I'm not going to go back up to very salty. If I overdo the salt one day and it's a little saltier, that's fine. I'm just not going to keep it there. Again, with these being so-called brackish animals, they're euryhaline animals, they can withstand a wide range of salinity. That's what euryhaline means. And as a result, a little bit more, a little bit less, I'm not going to worry too much about it. But I think I'm going to stay to the lower end, and I think I'm going to mix it up. I'm not going to do the same constant salinity all the time. I'm going to make it a little less saltier, a little more saltier, in any given water change. I'm just going to kind of mix it up and change it up. And I think everybody will be happier for it. So that's about it. I was going to try to do some waterfall tank update today, but alas, we did not have time to get to it. I don't like these to go too much longer than half an hour. I feel like that's a lot of info to pack into one session, so we will do the waterfall tank update tomorrow, I guess. So make sure you're subscribed, and that way you won't miss that or anything else. And then don't forget to check below for my email for plants, aquatic plants if you're interested. And don't forget to check out the link for that ChemiClean if you're interested in getting your tank looking all nice and spiffy. So thanks for watching. Don't forget this one is my 29 miscellaneous. And I'll see you real soon in the next one.